All right, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you to this week's installment of our Florida Talks at Home series. My name is Keith Simmons. I'm the Communications Director here at Florida Humanities, and I'm going to introduce tonight's program and introduce our speaker for the evening, Art Levy. Now, normally, Florida Humanities works with cultural partners across the state to put on programs like this in person, but obviously that can't happen right now. So our goal is to make this virtual series a regular event until we can begin convening in person once again. The next program in our Florida Talks at Home series is Dream State, which explores how each new wave of Florida settlers, from the mounds of the first people to modern golf courses and artificial lakes, have been reinventing the state to suit its new residents. That program takes place on Wednesday, December 9th at 6 p.m. You can register for that program by going to our website, floridahumanities.org/events. At the end of tonight's presentation, you will receive a short feedback survey in your email. We would greatly appreciate it if you could take a minute to fill it out for us. And by the way, if you have any questions for our speaker during tonight's program, you can type them into the chat field to the right inside this window here. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Your support, by the way, is essential to helping to sustain these programs. If you enjoy tonight's program, we ask that you consider visiting floridahumanities.org/support to contribute to our organization and to help us continue to provide programs like this in the future. And so again, tonight we welcome Art Levy, who is an award-winning journalist. He is an associate editor of Florida Trend magazine. He's also written for the St. Petersburg Times and the Sarasota Herald Tribune. Apart from writing and fact-checking, he interviews prominent Floridians from around the state for the magazine's Icon feature. Over the years, his stories have won more than 20 awards, and he is also the author of the University Press of Florida's Made in Florida: Artists, Celebrities, Activists, Educators, and Other Icons in the Sunshine State. So with that, I'd like for us to welcome Art Levy.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being here and being asked by the Florida Humanities Council to be on their list. This is a big honor for me to be here speaking to you from my home today in St. Petersburg. There really are so many wonderful and interesting people on the Florida Talk speakers list that I'm just really happy and grateful to be one of the names on the list. But probably if you ranked all the speakers from top to bottom on how well known they are throughout the state, I'd probably be at the bottom. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. First, I'm a print journalist, which I guess makes me a dinosaur in today's media world. And I've been around for a long time, so that does make sense. After graduating from the University of Florida with a degree in journalism, I got my first job at a newspaper in 1984. And I've worked for newspapers and now a magazine, Florida Trend, ever since. Back in 2007, I started contributing to a monthly feature for Florida Trend called Icon, which required me to go around the state and interview prominent Floridians. And I'm sure you can see the Made in Florida page on the PowerPoint. It says an exercise in listening. This is really when I started as a journalist, started to learn how to listen to people when I interviewed them, because for many years I would interview people, I'd be writing down quotes and I'd be getting color for my feature stories and all like that. But honestly, I really wasn't listening. I was listening more in terms for the story than actually to them. And but I've had to really learn how to listen for this feature, because the Icon feature reads a little differently than most interviews because it's told entirely in the interview's own words. So I do the interview, transcribe quotes, then pick the most interesting ones and arrange them in the best way to tell the interviewee's story. So far, since 2007, I've interviewed 120 people for this feature. And I have just a parade of people. I mean, 120 people is a lot of people. From Burt Reynolds and Shaquille O'Neal to Chris Everett and Edgar Mitchell, who's the sixth person to walk on the moon. A lot of people asking my favorites. I I like all of them. I really enjoyed interviewing these people. But some of them aren't that well known. Bill Haast, who was a snake handler from Punta Gorda, I really enjoyed. Quinn Studer, a businessman from Pensacola, was terrific. Marianne Gonzalez, a Special Olympics athlete from Central Florida, was great to meet. Sam Gibbons, a former U.S. congressman. The point is that this has really been a wonderful adventure for me, talking to all these people and learning so much about them. And also, in doing so, learning about Florida's culture and history. And the process has helped me see our state in a different way than many people, I think, are seeing it these days. For example, the perception of Florida today is often wrong, I think. The whole weird Florida thing kind of bothers me, and all the Florida man jokes kind of bother me too. I can't deny that Florida has a lot of weird stuff going on, but I think other states do too. And I think a lot of people in other states also do terrible and embarrassing things. And yet Florida seems to be associated with these more than any other state. So in some small way, I hope that these interviews can sort of act as an antidote to some of the weird Florida and Florida man stuff that's so popular on social media today. And like Keith said, 90 of these interviews, I've done 120. 90 of them were published in a book last year. And I've done, since the book went to press, I've done about 20 of them for Florida Trend. And also some of them didn't make the book for space reasons. And you can read all the old ones, the ones that aren't in the book, on floridatrend.com. But tonight I'm gonna just read a selection of parts of the interviews, just to give you a sense of our state, of the people in our state, and then we'll answer some questions. I'm going to start with Ron Bergeron, who is a really hard person to figure out. On one hand, he's a developer. His company builds roads and prepares sites for development. And on the other hand, he grew up in the edge of the Everglades, and he still gets emotional when he talks about the need to protect Florida's wildlands and wildlife. And then he's also somebody who's, even though he was a member of the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, he's also a guy who, for fun, would wrestle alligators. So let me read a little bit from Ron Bergeron. And remember, these are all told in their own quotes. Yes, I wrestle alligators. It's a Florida cultural thing, sort of like running with the bulls in Spain or fighting bulls in Mexico. That's because years ago, people ate alligators. So they would wrestle them, tie them up, and keep them. They didn't have refrigeration. So when they were ready to eat them, they'd eat them. That's how the culture started. He talks a little bit about growing up in Broward County. We didn't have tennis courts and golf courses in Davie, where I grew up. Actually, as a little boy, we didn't know what those things were, but we knew what rodeo was. Florida had cattle many decades, probably 80 years before the West did. In the 1500s, when the Spaniards landed on the west coast of Florida, some of their horses and cattle got loose, entered into the Everglades, and acclimated to the environment and multiplied by the millions. So Florida had America's first cow, first horse, and first cowboy. My grandfather took me on my first airboat ride when I was 3. I can still remember the way it felt, seeing the Everglades of God's creation, the wildlife, the smells, the sunset. My grandfather introduced me to a beautiful world, and I fell in love with it. I have a natural resort in the Big Cypress, and I let charities auction it off for people to spend the weekend with me. I introduce them to the beautiful Everglades. I always tell them, if you want me to wrestle an alligator, I'll wrestle one. So this one group of very prominent people asked me. I went in the water and started to wrestle one, and I missed his mouth. I'm on his back, and he wrapped his tail around my left leg and death rolled me with me on his back. He's biting by my ears, but he can't get me. And we're just going around and around and up and down. He twisted around and got my hand in his mouth. 2,000 pounds of pressure per square inch. My audience thought this was part of the show. They were actually clapping when this was all going on. I had to use the technique of going his way, go to the bottom, because that's where they want to bring you. They'll calm down because they think they got you. And he did calm down. I'm lying on the bottom of the lake, and I had to trick him into biting the other hand, and then he went for it. He opened his mouth, and I got out my other hand. Then I brought him to my stomach, and buddy, I could have whipped Superman's ass. My adrenaline was pumping. I kicked my way to 4 feet of water, stood up, got his mouth shut, and laid him on the shoreline. I said to the group, come on, let's take a few pictures, and then I'm going to go to the hospital and get my fingers sewed back on. And I'll end with this quote, which I think is pretty funny. I went to Davie Elementary School, the oldest school in Broward County. It was built in 1917. You know how when these things happen now, they lock the school down? Well, we had a panther sighting, and I'll never forget this. I was in the 1st grade, and they didn't lock the school down. They let us go outside and look for the panther. That usually gets people laughing, but I can't tell if people are laughing then. So I drove to Vero Beach to interview Carl Hiaasen, and it's funny. A lot of people in this book, especially other writers, mention Hiaasen during their interviews. He's funny, but he's very serious about his work, and I sense that he was very angry about what he sees going on in our state. Let me read a bit from him. Mostly we produce construction jobs in Florida. Construction for the sake of construction. That's basically the same mechanism as a cancer cell. Hoot, the first book I wrote for kids, was a page right out of my own childhood. The little owls and everything. That was me growing up in West Broward County. Near where we lived, there was a lot of open acreage, and it was purchased by a company that was going to build a condominium. There is an actress named Eve Arden. She was the spokesperson and was on all the billboards. The next thing we know, there were bulldozers and backhoes, and they cleared the land where these owls lived, these burrowing owls, and they just buried them alive. That pissed me off then, and it pisses me off today. When I start a novel, I have no idea where it's going to end. Sometimes I figure it out sooner. Sometimes I figure it out later. The later I figure it out, the more miserable I am. And my poor family has to put up with me walking around in a dark cloud while I'm trying to figure out how to wrap up the book. There's no question. Now, of course, Carl Hiaasen was one of the first people to write about weird Florida, but he did it in his novels. There's no question that there's a glorious abundance of weirdness and depravity in Florida. As a parent and a grandparent, you have to wonder, is this really where I want my kids to grow up? Is this really what I want my kids to see and experience? But more selfishly, as a writer, I think I'm in heaven. Joseph Heller had a tremendous impact on me, Catch-22, because he was dealing with the kind of the darkest of human conditions, war, and still managed to make you laugh. Think about my job as a newspaper columnist. Look at Tallahassee. Look at the complete festival of horrors up there. I will never run out of material, and I forgot to advance this. Okay, he said that in 2015, and it hasn't really changed that much. Florida is one of the most beautiful places in the country, but it's probably too beautiful for its own good. You have this great incoming stampede of people who fell in love with it and wanted it to be here, and then you have people who just want to exploit it. Florida has this incredibly welcoming attitude with regard to corruption. This is by far the crookedest place in the United States. When I started writing about this, no one gave a rat's ass about the Everglades in Tallahassee, not a rat's ass. And now it's a mom and pop apple pie issue. Everyone who runs for statewide office has to at least profess a love or passion for the Everglades. You can go online and see what stories are getting the most hits. If there's a story in the Herald tomorrow that says Kim Kardashian grows a third ass cheek, and another story, Iran tests a nuclear weapon next to Israel, which one do you think is going to get the most hits? Kardashian's ass every time. That's a bitter pill for all of us who believe people gravitate to what's really important. All right. I also talked to Dave Barry, who's actually a friend of Carl Hiaasen. And, you know, Dave Barry is very, very funny, but I'm not sure I did a good job interviewing him, because sometimes when you talk to prominent people, particularly prominent journalists, they know how to avoid questions and kind of say what they want to say. And I tend to, when I interview these people, to just ask a barrage of questions. And but I'm not sure I was able to dig deep enough with Mr. Barry, but let's see. All right. A lot of the time when I ended up writing a humor column about something, the thing that initially spurred it was not that funny to me at all. It was horrible when it happened. But then later you can say, oh, okay, I can write about that. A good example is colonoscopies. I ended up writing a humor column on it, but I don't recall at any point during my colonoscopy experience going, this is funny. My early years in the newspaper business were as a real reporter and a real editor. I really loved it. It was great fun. I learned a lot. I learned everything I know about journalism at the daily local news in Westchester, Pennsylvania. The only thing is, I realized at some point that nobody was reading anything I was writing. It's amazing when you think about it. 500 years ago, there were people in Florida, and we're not really totally civilized yet. I'm not a big fan of the Everglades. I know it's a precious ecological resource, but I don't actually believe that. I think it's a swamp. It has a tremendous number of bugs in it, and large pythons and muck. I'm sure it's really vital. But why couldn't it be somewhere else? Basically, it just makes it longer to get from here to Naples. Although I'm sure the people in Naples are glad they have this giant snake-infested barrier between them and Miami. They're afraid we'll come over and steal their dentures or something, which we would. You're a reporter and you go down to cover an organization with a name like the Downingtown Regional Sewage Commission, and the meeting is 3.5 hours long and involves something called interceptors, which you, an English major from Haverford College, know absolutely nothing about and never will know anything about. But you have to write 30 inches of a story about it with a big headline. If I were to go back and read those stories now, I would think to myself, what on earth did I think I was doing? Why would anyone care what the Downingtown Regional Sewage Commission had to say about interceptors? And why do you think you were the person to tell them? But that's sort of the essence of journalism. There are people I admire and learn from. Carl Hiaasen is the guy closest to me that I would use it as an example. The writers I loved growing up as a kid were Robert Benchley and P.G. Wodehouse. When I plot a book, especially Insane City, my last book, the writer I most thought about was P.G. Wodehouse. But the Florida element, nobody does it like Carl. This one's kind of interesting. This was said back in 2013. This was a long time ago. Anybody with completely, wildly out of control ambition and no particular views or ethics has a good shot of going far in this state. And it's always been that way. I contend, if he wanted to, Donald Trump in 3 years could be elected governor of Florida. And of course, he said that in 2013. I like Disney World. That's not a fashionable thing to say. Carl, I know, will disagree with me, but I have a connection with Disney. I've written books for them. But we like to go there and hang out, even just to watch the people and marvel at how large so many of them are, lumbering around, eating turkey legs. All right. Next is Patrick Smith. who I hope most of you know who he is. He's since deceased. He is the writer of A Land Remembered, which is probably the most iconic book set in Florida. It's amazing how many people in this Made in Florida book have read A Land Remembered and were impacted by it. The Patrick Smith interview was special to me because I interviewed him during the summer of 2013 at his home in Merritt Island, not long before he died. Since it was summer, my sons, who were young at the time, came along, and that was really nice. That was the only time that they've really been able to come with me for an interview. And Mr. Smith was not in great shape. He was actually in a hospital bed that had been set up in his living room. But he gave me all the time he needed, and he was very friendly to my boys. His wife gave them cookies and Coke, and it was a special day for them too. And both of them have since read A Land Remembered. He was a writer, but I think he wrote for a community, or he worked for a community college in Brevard County for his career. I was what was called a moonlight writer. That's some guy who works all day and then writes at night. It's a hard way to write. You give up a lot. You have to have the urge. If I could get out of this bed now, I'd like to write a novel about the Indian River Lagoon. It's a waterway that they say is dying. If it would actually die, it would affect not just the wildlife, not just the fish, but everyone. To me, accuracy is the most important part about writing. A lot of writers, accuracy doesn't bother them very much. If they make a big mistake, they just say, oh, this is fiction. But I always try to write accurately and create a picture of life as it really is, and people and things as they really are. I went down to the big cypress swamp one time and saw all these little chickie huts. It's very unusual to see people living that way. I had an idea I wanted to write something set down there close to the Everglades. So I was just looking around. That turned into my novel Forever Island. That's one of the things that young people who have read that's one of the things that young people who have read A Land Remembered question me about. Why does everybody have to die? They don't ever want anyone to die, but people do die, especially in Pioneer, Florida. Buddy Epson was a big fan of A Land Remembered. We talked by telephone about it several times, and then one day he just flew here from California, landed in Orlando, rented a car, and drove over here. He wanted to talk about everything in it. My wife, Iris, took a picture of him, but she cut off the top of his head. Researching the book, I had to read about a dozen books, I guess, about the specific things that happened in Florida, like the Great Freeze of 1895. You just can't dream that up. I had a lot of old timers, old pioneer people tell me stories. I'd sit down and talk to them. They tell me about living through the swarms of mosquitoes and alligators and all kinds of things. A Land Remembered is not based on a real family. It's based on dozens of real families. You know, it's funny. I did interview ranchers, a few old Florida families, and I talked to at least 2 or 3 people who thought that the book was based off of their family. Death doesn't scare me. I have emphysema. I broke a bunch of my bones, and before that I had cancer. I also had a really bad stroke. I've been hit so hard by what's got me in this bed that I am not afraid anymore. Anyway, I'd recommend reading his book. Next, Louise Gopher. She was an elder of the Seminole tribe, another great person. And I talked to her in 2014. She tells a story of growing up in Florida that sounds like fiction. She grew up around Lake Okeechobee and lived her final years on the Brighton Seminole Indian Reservation. And let me read a little bit from her. just gives you a sense of how Florida is it's got so many different components to it, so many elements to its history. I was born in Orange Grove because that's where my parents were working at the time. So that's where they established their camp. I was born in a chickie. Sometimes we would live in a trailer or some other structure. I must have been almost finished with school before I actually moved into a house with all the comforts: indoor bathrooms, indoor showers, running water. I was the first female member of the Seminole tribe to earn a bachelor's degree. I lived in Fort Pierce, and junior college had been built, Indian River Community College. And I finished 2 years there and then went to Florida Atlantic University. After a while, people kept saying, "She's been going to school forever." But I knew that education was helping me. The traditional foods are still my favorite foods. I like fry bread and sofki. Sofki is a drink that we drink all the time, anytime. It's made from grains like rice or grits or oatmeal. In the old days, it was made from roasted corn, which was a long procedure. We still make it that way, but not often. So when we have it, everybody jumps on it. We lived in camps near Fort Pierce with a lot of other families living nearby. My parents did agricultural work. It seemed like every evening there was a big bonfire or campfire, and we sat around, and that's when you listen to the stories and legends and learn the history. Living on the reservation feels comfortable and safe. I can't imagine having family living across the country. Here, they're all right down the street. I own beef cattle. I used to ride out where they are, where it's peaceful. They call to me and I talk to them. My father, DeSoto Tiger, he was killed when my mother was 2 weeks old. He's actually a history story himself. Did you ever hear of the John Ashley gang? They ran up and down the South Florida coast in the 1910s to about the 1920s. They were outlaws. Where my grandfather fits in, he was their first victim. He was a fur trapper and he was taking some otter hides down to Miami in 1911. John Ashley killed him and took the hides. Gopher is a Native American name, I guess. I don't know what it stems from. My sister's name was Smith. In fact, we had brothers with different last names: Frank Shore, Oscar Hall, Sam Jones. They just gave us names. When I interviewed Derek Brooks, I met him in his office when he was working as president of the Tampa Bay Storm at that time, which was an arena football team. He was very busy. When I arrived, there was other people in his office and he had charts and lists of players all over his desk, but he gave me his full attention. Even when the interview he was hoping to get over in 30 minutes lasted nearly 2 hours. I must say, of the 90 people in the Made in Florida book, Brooks was among the most impressive people. Let's hear a little bit from him. I didn't grow up wanting to be a professional athlete. My dream was to be an insurance man. That stems from an insurance man in Pensacola named Mr. Irving. He wore a suit, he drove a nice car, and he collected money, so I figured that was a good job to have. I got the courage one day, I was probably around 10, and I asked Mr. Irving, "How could I have a job like yours?" He told me to go to school, make good grades, and go to college. That was my motivation for a good bit until I got into high school and the football coaches got a hold of me. Every encounter I have is an opportunity to get better. After this meeting, you and I will have gotten better because we learned something about one another. In the 5th grade, I was being a class clown. I'd get through with my work and I'd be bored. And I'd get into a lot of disciplinary troubles because I was bored. My dad warned me and told me if I didn't get it together and stop being a class clown, he was going to show me how to get all the laughs I wanted. I called his bluff. I didn't think he'd have time to come to my school. Well, let's just say he caught me in the middle of one of my acts. He came in the classroom. Long story short, he took his belt off and whipped me in front of the whole class. I remember that story so vividly, running home crying. And my mom is home and she whips me for running home and leaving my dad. I was hysterical crying. That was a bad day. But I thank God they loved me enough to do it. No matter how successful you are, you have to learn to treat people with the respect they deserve. I had no right to disrupt a learning environment just because I was bored and selfish. I had no right to disrespect the teacher. I took that lesson to heart, and I basically still use it today. I treat others how I want to be treated. I was sold on Florida State very early in the recruiting process. When Coach Bowden came to the house to visit, he held my little sister in his lap, and she fell asleep. And my mom gets up to pick her up and put her to bed. And Coach B's like, no, I'm going to hold her. She's at home. After that, you couldn't tell my mom anything negative about Florida State. If you want to lead this nation as president, you have to win this state. That actually turned out not to be true this time. Not Iowa, you have to win Florida. He said that in 2015, though. I'll always be a country boy underneath the coat and tie. I enjoy sitting on a porch, just sitting there for hours. I grew up playing dominoes. I go to Pensacola. One of the first things I do is play dominoes. He started a charter school. The charter school is not about the name on the building. It's about the names in the building. When I visit, I say thank you more than anything, just because I understand how seriously I took my education in high school and how education paved my way. This is my passion. These students and these teachers trust my vision, and it's humbling. It's pressure, but it's humbling. Monty Kiffin, when he was with the Bucks, he was a former coach, his former defensive coach for the Bucks. Monty Kiffin, when he was with the Bucks, taught me this: the three most dangerous words are, quote, "I got it," because you never have it. You never ever have it. There's always an area for improvement. You just have to be willing to find it. Okay. And once again, I just collected this selection of 10 people to talk about tonight, but anybody, I think they're all interesting. Susan Benton was the sheriff of Highland County, located just about in the middle of the state. She was the first woman to be elected sheriff of a Florida county in a general election. I spoke to her in Sebring at the end of her term as she was preparing to retire. And let's read a little bit about her. After my husband passed away and my youngest son graduated from high school, I had to ask myself, what do you want to do now? My responsibilities up until then had been, first and foremost, maintaining my marriage, second, raising my children, and third, my profession. So the first two things were completed, and the thing that was left was my job. Then, after Sheriff Howard Godwin decided to retire, I began thinking that, wow, I could do that job. The biggest hurdle at the time, I thought, was being a woman, and in rural South Central Florida. Was that going to fly? A sheriff's deputy needs to have an ethical character and be someone you can trust to do the right thing, even when no one's looking. I ended up in Highlands County because my husband was a state trooper, and he got struck by lightning while working a wreck on the Palmetto Expressway in Miami. Because of that, after he went through extensive rehab, they transferred him to a less stressful area, which turned out to be Lake Placid, which is in Highlands County. She grew up in Miami, though. Growing up in Miami, I understand and appreciate the importance of diversity. Florida is an amazing place because of its diversity. I never hesitated to go into that bar fight or search that dark building at 2 a.m. But as a street deputy, if you have the ability to communicate and you use your skills wisely, you won't have to fight too many people. Now, I've had my share of fights, trust me. I've been on the lower end of them a time or two, too. But those situations are few and far between. Some folks may not agree with me, but I still think that the economy is driving some of these problems between citizens and law enforcement. We have a lot of folks out there who are hopeless about jobs and having a place to live and hopeless about being able to take care of their kids financially. We have a whole population of folks who are just lost. This is a personal opinion, but I see that in my jail. The majority of people in my jail are either mentally ill, involved with drugs and alcohol, or they're poor. Being the first woman elected in the state of Florida in a general election to the office of sheriff became a really big deal. I would get letters from young girls. I realized I had much more responsibility than just being the sheriff, operating a big budget, managing lots of people, and protecting and serving. I was also a role model, and that weighed heavy on me to be the kind of person I needed to be so I could be a role model for these young girls. When I first moved here, it was 1978 or 1979, and I went to work at the sheriff's office. But lo and behold, they didn't know what to do with the girl with police powers, so to speak. And I was relegated to working in the office with a crisscross tie on and a Peter Pan collared shirt. They had no women officially on patrol. At that time, I had 4 years of experience. I had a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, and so it took a toll on me. I basically cried and told my husband for 5 years to please take me back to Miami. But obviously, in hindsight, there is a plan in place, and I found my place eventually. The trust your community has in you as sheriff is only as good as their trust in you to police yourself. Next on my list tonight is George Allen. I'm not sure if anybody even knows who George Allen is, but he was an attorney, and I think he still is. He was the first African-American student to graduate from U.S. Law School. And a lot of people in Gainesville and many other places made it as tough on him as they possibly could. But he kept going and he got his degree. I was born in Sanford, Florida. This is George Allen. I was born in Sanford, Florida, which used to be a totally segregated community. I was home for a visit and went to the public library to do some research for a project. And I was told that I couldn't come into the white library. I just walked past the lady and found the books I needed and sat down. They whispered and pointed, but nobody beat me up, so I did my research. That's how I grew up. I experienced people getting beat up and mistreated just because they were Black. It was an injustice that the Florida Supreme Court, all those white justices, kept denying Virgil Hawkins the right to go to the University of Florida. Virgil kind of made a deal that he would give up his right to go if they would admit other Blacks. So Virgil sacrificed for me. I started working in the fields when I was about 10 years old. The white farmers would close down the Black schools in the winter because Sanford was a farming area, mostly celery at the time. And all of us Blacks who were able-bodied had to work in the fields. People were arrested for not working. You know, it's funny that fact that happened is mentioned in different ways by other people that I've talked to. It's really an interesting part of Florida's history. When I arrived at the University of Florida, they wouldn't let me live at married student housing because we were Black. I would receive telephone calls saying, N-word, N-word, we're going to kill you. And I tell them to go to hell. My dad gave me a rifle and said, if they come to your house, shoot them. I had young kids, so I taught them how to shoot. I made it known that I don't believe in nonviolence like Martin Luther King. You bother me, I'm violent. A friend of mine, Percy Lee, we were working in the fields cutting celery along with the other youngsters. The overseer, the straw boss, his name was Red Tile. He had a bad attitude and hated Black folk. He and Percy got into an argument about Percy was packing the celery. He said Percy sassed him, and he said that no N-word could talk to a white person this way. So he got a machete knife, and he said he was going to kill Percy. Percy's mother and my mother and father and a lot of the other grown-ups told him, no, you won't. They circled Percy, and I was in there with him. We had to get Percy out of the field because this guy was really going to kill him. I was admitted to Harvard and the University of California at Berkeley, but I'm a native Floridian, and I felt that somebody had to integrate the University of Florida. The racist told me that I didn't belong there, and I'd never graduate. I got into one or two fights with students who were disrespectful, but I never considered quitting. I made it known that you're not going to make me run away. You're not going to scare me. I'm going to outstudy all of you, and I'm going to graduate. My father always told me to be careful around white folk, and especially white women. Don't appear friendly because that will get you into trouble. So I was very careful. I knew people who were killed for saying hello. There's this janitor at UF. He resented the fact that I was a student because I was Black. The bathrooms on campus were just public bathrooms. They didn't have colored and white bathrooms at the law school. So I went into the bathroom. So if I went into the bathroom, he would stand around and wait for me to come out before he would go in. So this one day I'm there and he's obviously in distress, needing to use the bathroom. So he came in and looked and saw me, and I stayed there, washed my hands 3 or 4 times, and he kept coming back. And finally, I had my briefcase with me. I just took out my books and I studied there in the bathroom to keep him from using it. If he won't use the bathroom with a Black, then let him go somewhere else. I stayed there about 30 minutes studying in the bathroom. I was 36 and I had this yellow Rolls Royce, which my wife allowed me to buy. I get stopped by the cops, so I got rid of that one and bought a gray one. At the time, I was doing a lot of civil rights work, and the IRS audited me for 15 straight years. My accountant, who formerly worked for the IRS, told me in order to stop the audits, get rid of the Rolls Royce. I said, fine. I bought a brand new checker and the audit stopped. In Groveland, Florida, my wife and I built a log cabin. The sheriff who used to be up there, Willis McCall, he was a really racist guy who was involved in that Groveland case. He killed a prisoner and shot another one in the back. Anyway, that was the county where I built that log cabin, and my dad told me I was crazy and tried to talk me out of it. But I said, hey, they don't do that kind of stuff now. It's better now. So they burned the cabin, and the sad part was they know who burned it, and they never arrested anybody. That was the late 1980s, early 90s. All right. I spent about 3 hours talking to Lucy Morgan at her home in Tallahassee. And generally these interviews last maybe 2 hours. When they get to be about 3 hours, that gets to be about maybe a bit much, and maybe not as productive as they need to be when they're that long. But anyway, Lucy Morgan, who won a Pulitzer Prize working for the St. Pete Times, is a bit like George Allen, very brave and very tough. And here's a little bit from her. You get my antenna up if I hear about something that is really wrong that nobody's doing anything about. When I was a child and my mother began to read me a story, my first question was, is this really true? If it was not a true story, I had no interest in it. Reading got me my first job as a reporter. In 1965, I was living in Crystal River, married to a high school football coach, and had 3 children at home. A woman knocked on my door and introduced herself as the area editor of the Ocala Star-Banner. Her name was Frances DeVore. She asked me if I would write for the Ocala paper. I said, well, I don't know. I've never written anything. Why would you come to me? She said, well, the local librarian tells me that you read more books than anybody else in this town. And I thought perhaps if you could read, you could write. I started out working for Ocala, covering West Citrus County and Levy County. At my first Citrus River City Council meeting, I found that the council was very accustomed to telling the reporters who were there, don't write this. They would then proceed to do something controversial, and the reporters wouldn't write about it. I just ignored it and wrote about what they were doing, which put me in controversy from the very beginning. There were times when, as a single mother, that I simply had to take the kids with me. I remember a 3 a.m. fire in a hotel in Newport Richey. I ran through the bedrooms and said, okay, kids, you're going to have to come with me. My middle son started loading his toys because he thought our house was on fire. I remember standing outside the courthouse after a 9-year-old was killed by a 12-year-old, and I was talking to the father of the dead child. At one point, he stopped me and he said, you have no idea what I'm going through. And I said, you're right, I don't, because I haven't lost a child. Later, after my son was killed in the traffic accident, I understood. The reduction of staff at news organizations has dramatically changed the way we cover the news. I think we've lost a great deal. I think we've created black holes, particularly in small counties where no one knows what's going on until something really erupts. I had people who would call me and ask to meet me in Steinhatchee on the bridge at midnight. And I'd say, how about the courthouse steps at noon? The Florida Sheriff's Association had me speak to a convention one year of newly elected sheriffs, and I proceeded to tell them what not to do, essentially. I told them I had mixed emotions because it might cut the number of really good stories about the bad things they were about to do, but I decided to go ahead because most of them would ignore the advice anyway. One of the nice things about covering a group of good old boys is they presume that a woman has no brain, and in my case, they presumed that until it was too late. When people tried to intimidate me, it didn't work. Maybe I was stupid, but I kept thinking, because I was a Southern woman, that these good old boys were less likely to try to kill me than they would a guy. I could yawl them just as well, or I could yawl just as well as they could. My son was 18. It happened on the Courtney Campbell Causeway, March 1979. There was a knock on our door at like 6 a.m., which you know can't be good. My biggest truth, I guess, came the next morning at 6:30 a.m. My husband had been answering the phone, but he was in the shower, so I picked up the phone, and a woman whose voice I recognized said, "Is this Lucy Morgan?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, I'm glad your son died." I'd been covering stories on a trial involving her husband and a claim against the builder, and they had lost the trial. I was the Tallahassee bureau chief at the time, and I had all I could handle covering the governor and the legislature. But I got a call from a law enforcement official who said, "There's this sheriff in Gulf County, and he's requiring women in his jail to provide him with oral sex, and we have a prosecutor who doesn't want to prosecute him. Those are hard charges to prove, for one thing, because in this case, you're dealing with women in jail whose reputations weren't very good. So I went over and started interviewing people and did some stories on it. The U.S. Attorney's Office impaneled a grand jury, and 22 women went and testified that they had been subjected to this treatment. He was found guilty, and after the trial, I went back to my office, and someone had sent me a dozen roses with a card that said, quote, "From the woman you believed. It moved me to tears. That's better than any prize you could ever win." All right. Marianne Carroll was one of my first interviews. I interviewed her in Fort Pierce, and that was really nice. She was, you've all heard of the Florida Highwaymen painters. Well, she was one of those painters. She was the first. She was among the original Highwaymen painters, but she was the only woman who was among them. And I've talked to a lot of artists over the years: James Rosenquist, Romero Brito, Jerry Uelsman, Herb Schnitzer, and one of my favorites was Mike Peters, the Mother Goose and Grimm cartoonist. But Carroll is really a favorite of mine. Once again, a very tough person. I met Harold Newton by the road in Fort Pierce. He was one of the first highwaymen. It was his car that attracted my eye. There were flames painted on it. He did that for attention. He told me what he did, and he showed me his paintings in the back seat. I watched him paint. He wasn't my teacher, though. He showed me how to mix oils, but when I was a child, I could already draw anything I saw. Then I started going on the road with the guys. I was probably 18 when I sold my first painting. When I was young, the options I had were cleaning houses, babysitting, picking fruit, nurse's aide. Basically, that was it for a woman. But I wanted to be a painter, and there were things I had to do to support my art. I never picked fruit. I did some babysitting, and I did some house cleaning. I worked in a gladiola field when I was younger, cutting the flowers with a pocket knife. My husband left me and the kids when the youngest was 5. So I had 7 children to raise, and I had to have money. They had to eat. They had to have a place to sleep. They had to have clothes. I had to provide. I raised 7 kids as a single parent. A lot of times I went on the road. I would take my kids with me. If I went on the road when they were in school, I made sure I got back before school got out. The painting enabled me to be a mother or a mama, daddy, caretaker, and all that I had to do. I didn't worry about my safety. I used to be thin, and I can jump high as a house. I was strong. I was happy. I wasn't afraid to walk anywhere. I wasn't afraid of breaking down along the side of the road. I'd have a gun, maybe a 22 or 38 in the car, only for my protection. I didn't really feel like I could find a person who I couldn't take care of as long as they would fight fair. I would do at least 2 24 by 36 paintings a day. It was hard work. An 18 by 24 would sell for $18, a 24 by 36 for $35. A 12 by 24 was $12.50. People commission me now, and the price depends on what they want me to do. These landscapes are true Florida scenes, and a lot of these things I paint, you don't see anymore. Treasures are being destroyed. That's why I like painting landscapes. It's painting history. It actually kind of breaks my heart to think about the things that aren't here anymore. I look across the street from my house and I see houses where I used to see trees. What am I going to do by the grace of God sometime soon? I'm going to paint that scene, but I'm going to take all those houses out of there and I'm going to bring back the trees. All right. Manuel Su is one of our state's great entomologists, which is actually what my son wants to be, and he's studying to be an entomologist right now. For you homeowners out there, Su's research is responsible for the deaths of billions of termites across our state. So I guess that's good. All right. Catch a dragonfly and look at the wings with all those veins, a very intricate network of veins. To me, that's fascinating, just totally fascinating and beautiful. You know, I was always interested in biology, except I hate blood. I can't handle blood. If you want to study biology, if the subject matter is an animal, then you have to dissect that animal, kill it, and there's blood. It's messy. So I decided to go into insects because you don't see blood. Well, they have blood, but it's not red. My wife, Jill, she was my partner, my best friend. We met in Japan, so we shared the Japanese experience together. We shared a lot. We lived together for 33 years. Jill's murder was a big, big shocker. Not to mention what my son went through so much trauma. He's the one who found the body. I used to weep every day. It's still very sad. Everything reminds me of her. Her clothes, I still have her clothes. I don't think I can ever remove any of these things. Florida has a lot of invasive species. People bring plants and animals here all the time, and the climate is so good, it encourages these invasive species to thrive. The problem is they're replacing native species. Somebody's going to have to pay attention to this. Otherwise, these invasive species will take over. Our job is to basically raise our voice and say this is happening. But government really needs to do something about it. When I was in Taiwan as a kid, I go outside, no shoes, and run around all day looking for insects, looking under rocks, looking for something that moved. Children are very sensitive. If the parent is paying attention to baseball, basketball, football games day and night, the children are going to pay attention to basketball, football games day and night. If you really want the children to pay attention to STEM and science, the parents in society have to change. I still have the same house. I'm not going to move anywhere. The house still has a lot of memories. It's the house that Jill and I built. Everything inside she decorated. She's everywhere in the house. We learn to live with the pain. That's all you can do. Robert Cade, a UF researcher who invented Gatorade, is a hero. Dr. Cade, if you read what he had to go through to get Gatorade on the market, it's amazing. He was a pioneer. By encountering all those difficulties, he made it easy for other inventors. My wife used to think that I act like a kid sometimes. It's true. Deep inside, I'm still that 6-year-old boy chasing the dragonfly and being totally impressed by the beauty of it. And that's all. I can read more. I can read one that I just did. It hasn't even been in the magazine yet if you want. Want me to?
Well, yeah, I'm curious. What is the interview that you just did that hasn't been published yet?
This is number 120. It's Brian Norcross, who's the weatherman from Miami who stayed on air for like 23 straight hours during Hurricane Andrew. And he's a weatherman. Okay, here, I'll do it real quick. Broadcasting during Hurricane Andrew, I said some of the smartest things I ever said in my life. One of them was, quote, "Okay, folks, here's what I want you to do. I want you to get a mattress off the bed. I want you to get to a closet or in a hallway or in a bathroom and get your family under that mattress." I heard from so many people afterward that after the storm passed, when they came out from beneath the mattress, that they looked up and they saw sky. Miami is one of the most amazing cities. In some ways, the most amazing city. It's the only city in the United States, and maybe the only major city in the world, where there's no dominant culture. You go from one place to another and you actually switch cultures. I love that. I think that's what makes the city magical. When you read the morning paper, you might not read every detail of a story that you were interested in, but you would glance at it. It was a routine thing to have a breadth of knowledge. Now people gravitate towards what they want to hear. That's evolved very dangerously, I think, into people feeling betrayed if they don't hear what they want to hear. To some degree, this is the issue of our times. If you can't communicate, how do you have a democracy? I wanted to be a disc jockey, and I got a chance to do that when I was in high school at a little radio station in Melbourne. I got them to hire me for no money, just paying for my gas to get out there to work on the weekends. But the first time I was on the air, I was just there answering the phone, and the program director hands me the AP copy and tells me to read the news. I needed a radio name because Brian Norcross, first of all, it's kind of hard to say because of the two N's together. And I also thought it was a totally uncool name. So in the spur of the moment, I came up with Barry O'Brien. And I was Barry O'Brien, and I was Barry O in the radio for my first couple of radio jobs. Science is under attack for the same reason that American institutions are under attack. We live in a world of misinformation. Growing up in Indialantic, which is near Melbourne, we lived only 3 blocks from the ocean. So 4 or 5 days a week, I would be at the beach. Now I live in Miami Beach and I almost never go to the beach, which people find amusing and amazing. But when I do go to the beach, just to feel the water, especially on a day when the waves are big, that really takes me back. The world has changed a lot in the last 50 to 60 years. But just going in the ocean and remembering the feel of riding the waves, that's my connection to being young. That's just a little bit of Brian Norcross.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating, especially the fact that he had been broadcasting for so long during that hurricane. I mean, that in itself also has to be an incredible story, I imagine.
Yeah, there's a little bit more about that in here, but yeah.
So, and thank you again for taking the time to speak with us this evening. And so again, for our audience, if you have any questions, type them into the chat box and we'll try to work as many as we can into our conversation with the time that we have remaining. We did have a couple of questions that came up during your presentation that I think are kind of interesting. And one of the questions that was sort of asked is if you've ever been denied an interview, and especially if it was someone that you had been particularly interested in talking to.
Oh, lots of times. Yeah, my percentage is pretty high, but I get denied all the time. And then like there's people that I like there's one person I've been trying to get in touch with for probably about, 10 years is Jimmy Buffett. Won't talk to me. Mm. There's actually there's a little part in the book where I describe all the people that said no to me, but generally though, not too bad. Jimmy Buffett. I've had some business people say no to me. I've had some politicians say no to me. I've had politicians say, like, I'll talk to you after that happens or after that election, and then they never talk to me.
So I think it kind of leads to another question, which is, who's on the dream list of Floridians that you want to interview? At this stage, I'd rather talk to the snake handler than the famous person, honestly. That's always how I've been as a journalist. In fact, early in my career, I never wanted to talk to anybody who was well known because I thought that the story was already known, but I would rather get deep inside of someone that people didn't know. So I don't really have anybody specifically that I'm pining for. If out of the blue, Jimmy Buffett would call me today and say, let's talk, especially during the pandemic, I go, God, how's that going to work? I'm going to have to talk to him on the phone or something. So there's really nobody except an interesting person
a person with a story to tell, like a George Allen, who I don't know how many people out there know who George Allen was, but he's an important historical figure. That's the kind of person I want to talk to.
You talk a little bit about trying to do these interviews, particularly in our current moment with the pandemic. How has that sort of changed the way that you approach interviews? Do you feel like it kind of changes the dynamic if it's purely a phone interview and you can't really read, facial expressions and body language and that sort of thing?
Yeah. That's not really a problem for me because I don't have to worry about those nuances anymore, because I'm just basically presenting quotes. If I was writing a feature story, it'd be very hard to do it over the phone. But the problem is, it's very hard to do it over the phone now, because the way people talking over the phone, I can't get to them like I can in person. I can't use my facial expressions to sort of show them that answer needs to be more than what they've given me. And so it's much more difficult. But on the other hand, people are much more likely to talk to you on the phone than talk to you in person, because a lot of times when I talk to people in person, I'd have to go weeks in advance, and I'd have to set something up because I had to travel and I had to get up early in the morning, because I have my family. I wouldn't want to spend the night in Tallahassee or someplace, so I'd get up early in the morning and go and do it. It's much easier to do it by phone. I've not tried Zoom. Maybe I should do that.
Yeah, I think Zoom is certainly an option. It seems to be the thing that has become fairly standard in a really short amount of time because of COVID. And, I think a lot of us have someone in our lives who, has an interesting story, particularly as it relates to COVID. And if you're like a healthcare worker, if you're someone who's on the front lines. And so I wonder do you have any advice for some of us if we want to interview someone, either right now about their experiences, or a year or 5 years, or even 10 years from now? I mean, what goes into a really good interview?
Okay, well, yeah, like I said before, I've been a journalist since 1984. I got my first job in 1984. But I really didn't have successful interviews really until I started doing this. And the reason I was able to, I think, do a better job, two things, and they're both important. The second one's the most important. The first thing is you got to do a lot of research beforehand. You got to show up at the interview with lots of questions, have lots of information that you want to ask about. I'll show up sometimes with 5 pages of questions, but anybody can do that. What's hard for people, and it's for me too, is a lot of times I tape everything. And so when I go through the tape and transcribe everything, the 2-3 hours of interview that I got to transcribe, when I do that, I kick myself so much because I felt myself interrupt too much. And I try not to interrupt. I interrupt much less than I used to. Being silent, I can do that, but that's really valuable. When you're silent, the person oftentimes will fill that space because it's awkward, it's uncomfortable. But I still find myself way too often, even now, talking too much. And my friends and family know that I'm not a big talker. I can ask a question and sit back, but still it's hard to hold back and not interrupt sometimes when I could just ruin a quote that way. So prepare and don't interrupt. Those are my 2 tips.
Well, no, I think those are certainly some valuable ways in terms of approaching these types of conversations. And speaking of conversations and interviews that you've done, do you like everyone, or have you liked everyone that you've interviewed, or have you done an interview with someone that this is probably going to be interesting, but I might not necessarily care for this individual? And if you did interview someone that you didn't like, did it turn out to be ultimately kind of interesting or engaging?
Yeah. I mean, there have been some that I don't like, definitely, and there are some people that I know I'm not going to like who I won't approach because I don't really want to. I don't want to do it. You know, I don't want to. I don't. I don't need to ask the person who I know I'm not going to like, or I don't really respect what they do. There's a lot of people that people have suggested, particularly people in the celebrity world, who I just have no interest in talking to. But there's been a few people that I show up without too many opinions other than my questions. But there's been some people that I've left where I thought, wow, that person's really impressive. I'm really impressed, and that's journalists are not impressed by other people. They just do the story, and it's not in my best interest to be impressed by other people. That's just not how I do the job. But I have left thinking, wow, that person's really impressive. Like I mentioned before, Sam Gibbons, the former congressman who was a D-Day vet. I left that one. I was like, wow, that guy's really impressive. And I've done that scores of times since. And there's been fewer people where I've left and gone, gosh, I'm glad that's over. I hope I have enough. I probably do. But not that many of them, where I've just been sort of like, I don't like this person. But even if I like him or not, it doesn't matter because I'm a journalist and that doesn't matter to me. If my story reflects that I don't like them, then shame on me. And so I don't do that.
No, and I think that certainly makes sense. And I think the last question I kind of want to ask you is talking about your work at Florida Trend in doing these interviews, and we kind of discussed this a little bit before we came on the air, and trying to tell sort of this statewide story that pulls Florida together. There are a lot of real individual communities, and we think about regions, like South Florida, Central Florida, and the Panhandle. How do you feel like your work and all these interviews that you've done, how does this help to sort of tell a statewide story and the power that's in that?
Yeah. Well, Trend does a good job with that. We try to pick stories that sort of tie together certain topics that are of interest to the whole state. We also cover things individually too. The icon feature, I think, is kind of an example of how difficult it is to say Florida is one place, because the experiences here are so different, from somebody who grew up in Central Florida in the 30s to somebody who grew up in Miami in the 60s. But so by reading the icon interviews together, you get a sense of Florida, because Florida is so hard to get a handle on, so diverse, that you sort of get that picture just by being exposed to hundreds of its citizens, and then listening to their stories and hearing their histories, and that sort of tells Florida in a little different way than maybe a single soundbite, which is impossible.
No, it certainly is impossible, and I think that's the exact kind of thing that we are trying to do at Florida Humanities, is going beyond that soundbite and wanting to have really more of a robust conversation. And so I think your interviews and all these stories that you're capturing absolutely do that. So we certainly appreciate the work that you do, and we appreciate you taking the time to hang out with us this evening.
Well, and thank you for facilitating this too. I really appreciate it.
No, absolutely. And thank you again to all of our audience members who joined us this evening. Remember, after this program concludes, you're going to receive a survey. Let us know how we did, ways that we can improve for next time. And don't forget to join us for our next program that's going to be on Wednesday, December 9th at 6 p.m. You can learn more about that and register by going to floridahumanities.org/events. So again, until next time, thanks so much, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.